The Fear Factory Stories.
I should have trusted my instincts when we first heard the chanting. My best friend, Michael, and I had been talking about a camping trip for months, a chance to escape from the daily grind of our lives in Seattle. We both needed a break. The idea was to find a remote spot, far from the city noise, somewhere in the dense expanse of Redwood National Park in Northern California. The weekend forecast promised clear skies, and we were ready for an adventure. We set out early Saturday morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The drive took us deeper into the woods, the towering redwoods forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. Michael and I felt a rush of excitement as we left our car at the edge of a narrow trail and began our hike into the heart of the forest, backpacks loaded with supplies. As we moved further away from the road, the sounds of civilization faded. All we could hear were our footsteps crunching over fallen leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird overhead. The forest seemed alive, but in a way that felt almost too still, like it was waiting. We found a secluded clearing after a few hours of hiking, a perfect place to set up camp. It felt hidden, almost untouched, like a secret corner of the world no one had discovered yet. We pitched our tent, gathered firewood, and settled in as the sun began to set. The temperature dropped quickly, and the trees around us seemed to grow taller and darker as the light faded. We lit a fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, sending shadows across the trunks of the giant redwoods. We shared stories, laughed about old times, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of being far away from everything. It was around midnight when I woke up. The fire had burned down to faint embers, and the night was deathly quiet. At first I thought it was the cold that had woken me, but then I heard it, a soft rustling sound just outside the tent. I sat up, my pulse quickening. Michael was still asleep beside me. The sound came again, closer this time, like something moving through the underbrush. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered into the darkness. The forest was a wall of black, with only the faintest glow from the dying embers to light the clearing. I scanned the area but saw nothing unusual until I noticed the footprints. They were large, fresh, and they led directly toward our tent. A chill ran down my spine. I nudged Michael awake, whispering his name. He grumbled, but quickly sat up when he saw the look on my face. I pointed at the prints. His eyes widened with alarm. We listened, holding our breath, trying to hear anything beyond the pounding of our own hearts. That's when it began. A low, eerie chanting coming from the direction of the trees, faint at first, almost like the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, or maybe more than one, and the tone was unsettling, a rhythmic murmur that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Michael grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the dense darkness. The chanting grew louder, closer, filling the air with a chilling energy that made my skin crawl. Then we saw him. A gaunt figure stepped out from behind a tree, his clothes hanging in tatters, his face obscured by matted hair. His eyes were hollow, like dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. He moved toward us, his lips still muttering that strange chant, his steps slow but deliberate. Michael and I were frozen, fear gripping us like a vice. For a moment we just stared, unable to move. Then without warning he lunged forward, his chant turning into a guttural scream. Michael snatched a burning branch from the fire, swinging it wildly in front of him. The embers flared up, and the figure recoiled, letting out a low growl. His eyes flickered with something, a glint of recognition or fear, I couldn't tell. He hesitated, then turned and disappeared back into the darkness, the chanting fading with him. We didn't waste a second. We grabbed what we could, leaving the tent and most of our gear behind, and bolted through the forest. The branches whipped against our faces as we ran, the air cold and biting. I could still hear the faint echo of the chanting in my ears, like a sinister whisper following us. When we reached the car, we were out of breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. We drove straight to the nearest ranger station and told them everything. The ranger didn't seem shocked. He told us about a man known to wander these woods, performing strange rituals and scaring off anyone who came too close. He warned us to stay away from that part of the park in the future. We never went back to Redwood National Park. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I can still see those hollow eyes, hear that eerie chant, and feel the cold air of the forest pressing in around me. And every time I do, a shiver runs down my spine, reminding me of the shadows that hide where the light never reaches. I knew I should have kept driving that night, but something made me stop. The storm was fierce, hammering down like it was trying to wash the entire highway away. I was driving home from a double shift at the diner, just off Route 66, my old pickup truck struggling against the wind and rain. The windshield wipers worked frantically, but they could barely keep up with the torrential downpour. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the empty, winding road ahead. I was exhausted. All I wanted was to get back to my tiny apartment in Flagstaff, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The road twisted through the desert, lined with cacti that looked like shadows in the flashes of lightning. Every now and then the sky would light up, showing the vast, empty landscape before plunging back into blackness. That's when I saw him, a figure, soaked and shivering, standing by the side of the road, his thumb extended for a ride. For a moment I hesitated. I knew better than to pick up hitchhikers, especially on a night like this. But there was something about him, the way he stood there, slumped over and desperate, that pulled at me. I slowed down, my heart pounding. I couldn't just leave him out there in the middle of nowhere, could I? I thought about how I would feel if I were him, stranded in the middle of a storm with no place to go. I sighed, feeling a mix of dread and empathy, and pulled over. The man approached the truck slowly, his face obscured by the rain and shadows. I leaned over and unlocked the passenger door. "Hop in," I called out. He climbed in without a word, his clothes dripping water all over the seat. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "There's a gas station. You can drop me off there." I nodded. pulling back onto the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The man sat in silence, staring straight ahead. The truck felt smaller with him in it, and the air seemed thicker, heavier. The rain pounded on the roof, drowning out any sound except the steady thud of the wipers. I glanced over at him. He looked to be in his late 30s, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a worn-out jacket that clung to his frame. His face was pale, and his eyes were dark, unreadable. There was something off about him, something that set my nerves on edge. Minutes passed, and the silence became unbearable. I could feel him watching me, even though he never turned his head. My skin prickled with a sense of unease, a growing fear that made me want to press the gas pedal and drive faster. Finally, the gas station came into view, a lonely outpost on the side of the highway with flickering neon lights. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the parking lot. I had never been so happy to see a rundown gas station in my life. "This is it," he said quietly, breaking the silence. I nodded, pulling up to the entrance. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain without another word. As the door closed, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was alone again, the feeling of dread slowly beginning to fade. But just as I was about to drive away, something caught my eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the passenger seat. I hadn't noticed him leave anything behind. My curiosity piqued. I reached over and picked it up. The note was damp, the ink slightly smudged, but I could still make out the words, "Check the back seat." My heart skipped a beat. I turned slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel, and glanced into the back seat. The truck was dark, the only light coming from the neon glow of the gas station sign. My eyes struggled to adjust to the shadows, but I could see the outline of the empty seat behind me. My hands began to shake. Was this some kind of joke? Or had there been someone else with us the entire time? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I quickly locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the button. I stared out at the rain, my pulse racing. The gas station lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the lot. I wanted to get out of there, to leave this place behind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I looked at the note again, my stomach twisting. Why would he leave a warning like that? And why did I feel like I wasn't truly alone? I swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and threw the truck into gear. I needed to put as much distance between myself and that gas station as possible. The rain continued to pour down, and the wind howled like a wild animal. But I kept driving, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Even as I sped away, the roads stretching into the dark desert night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still there with me, hidden just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of the back seat. The storm hit like a freight train, hammering against the windows with a ferocity I hadn't seen in years. The rain pounded down, sounding like thousands of impatient fingers drumming against the glass. I sat in the dim light of the living room, listening to the wind howl like a caged beast, feeling the chill creep into the house. My parents had left an hour ago, called away by an emergency at the hospital where they both worked. They said they'd be back soon, but now, as the storm raged on, I wasn't so sure. I kept glancing at the clock, each tick echoing through the empty house. I was 16, not a child anymore, but tonight felt different. There was something unsettling in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but the flickering lights and static only made everything feel more surreal. The lights dimmed for a moment, flickering as if they too were deciding whether to stay on or give up. I kept glancing at the clock, each tick echoing through the empty house. I was 16, not a child anymore, but tonight felt different. There was something unsettling in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but the flickering lights and static only made everything feel more surreal. The lights dimmed for a moment, flickering as if they too were deciding whether to stay on or give up. Then I heard it, a sharp knock at the door. It was so unexpected that I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. Who would be out in this weather, in the middle of the night? I hesitated, holding the TV remote like a weapon, before slowly getting up and moving towards the door. The knock came again, louder this time. I peered through the peephole and saw a woman standing on the front porch. She was soaking wet, her hair clinging to her face, her clothes plastered to her skin like a second layer. At first I didn't recognize her, but then it clicked. She was the new neighbor from 3 houses down, the one who had just moved in last week. We'd exchanged a few words, polite, small talk, but that was it. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see her face clearly. Her eyes were wide, almost frantic, and her smile seemed strained, like she was trying too hard. "Are you alone?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The question sent a chill down my spine. Why would she ask that? For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. She tilted her head slightly, studying me, and then without another word, she turned around and walked back into the rain. I stood there, frozen, watching her fade into the darkness, the rain swallowing her up until she was gone. I quickly shut the door, locking it tight. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I tried to convince myself it was just a harmless question, that maybe she was just worried. But the way she left, without saying anything else, without even looking back, felt all wrong. I returned to the living room, but I couldn't focus on the TV anymore. The house seemed to hold its breath, like it was waiting for something to happen. I kept glancing at the front door, half expecting her to come back, but the only sound was the relentless rain drumming against the roof. An hour passed, maybe more, and I started to relax, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it. Footsteps, faint at first, just a soft creaking above me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The footsteps grew louder, moving slowly from one room to the next, deliberate and steady, like someone searching for something or someone. Panic surged through me. I bolted from the living room, heading for the front door, but before I reached it, the footsteps stopped. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, heart pounding. I forced myself to turn around, my eyes slowly drifting up the stairs. Nothing, just shadows stretching across the walls in the dim light. I took a deep breath and crept up the stairs, each step a battle against the fear rising in my chest. When I reached the top, everything was silent. I turned towards my parents' bedroom, the door slightly ajar, and pushed it open. 2 men were standing inside, their backs to me. They were dressed in black, their faces hidden by shadows, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't recognize them. I didn't know what to do. I had to act fast. I ran down the street, not stopping until I was far from the house. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice barely steady enough to explain what happened. By the time they arrived, the house was empty, the men gone, leaving only signs of a break-in. No one knew who they were or what they wanted. But as I stood there, soaked and shivering, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that they would come back, or worse, that they had never really left. If I had known what would happen, I would have never stopped that night. I've been driving trucks for nearly 15 years, crisscrossing the country from Arizona to Montana. The road has always been my refuge. Long, empty highways under vast skies, the steady hum of the engine, my only company. But that night on Highway 89, just outside of Flagstaff, was different. It's a night that still haunts me. It was past midnight, maybe closer to 1 a.m., and I was on a lonely stretch of road, the kind where you don't see another car for miles. The sky was moonless, pitch black, with only the occasional flicker of lightning in the distance. I was tired, my eyes heavy from hours of driving, and I was counting down the minutes until I reached the next rest stop, still about 30 miles away. As I rounded a sharp curve, my headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing on the shoulder. At first I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer, but as I got closer, I saw it was a man. He stood alone in the darkness, wearing an old oversized coat that seemed far too warm for an Arizona summer night. His head hung low, his hair wet and matted over his face. I could feel something was off, a cold shiver running down my spine, but I tried to brush it aside. I had seen plenty of odd things on the road over the years. Hitchhikers were nothing new, and maybe he was just another poor soul who had run out of luck. I slowed down, not because I wanted to stop, but because curiosity got the best of me. Why would anyone be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? My truck rolled to a stop a few yards away from him. For a second, I thought about hitting the gas and driving away, but something held me back. The man hadn't moved an inch. He just stood there, as if he didn't even notice my headlights bearing down on him. I honked the horn, a quick, sharp blast. His head jerked up, and that's when I saw his face. My heart skipped a beat. His skin was ashen, almost translucent under the headlights, and his eyes were wide, empty, like dark holes staring straight through me. I felt an overwhelming urge to drive away, but then he lifted his hand and pointed down the road, like he was asking for a ride. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. Everything in me screamed to leave, but something in his gaze, desperate, pleading, made me pause. Against my better judgment, I reached over and unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in without a word, his movements slow and almost mechanical. The door closed with a soft click, and suddenly the truck seemed much smaller. The air felt heavier, almost stifling. I tried to break the tension with some small talk, asking him where he was headed, but he just stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. His silence was unnerving, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. As we drove, I glanced over at him. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, covered in dirt or something darker. I couldn't be sure in the dim light. I tried not to think about it, but my heart was racing. I had picked up strangers before, but this felt different. I felt trapped in my own cab, the space growing smaller with each passing second. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I saw the rest stop lights flickering in the distance. I was filled with relief, but also a strange dread. The man hadn't said a single word the entire time, but his presence had grown heavier, more oppressive. I pulled into the rest stop and parked, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. He turned to me then, and his eyes, those black, empty eyes, met mine. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Without saying a word, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. I watched him walk away, disappearing into the shadows beyond the rest stop lights. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, trying to steady my breathing, to calm the pounding in my chest. It took me a long time to convince myself to move, to believe that it was over. But even now, on those lonely nights when I'm driving down dark highways, I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those empty eyes staring back at me, waiting for the next ride. Looking back, there were signs, small things that seemed harmless at first, but now send a chill down my spine. I had always loved the idea of living alone. After years of sharing cramped apartments in Boston with college roommates and then moving in with a friend in New York, I finally found a place of my own. It was a small, charming house in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. I loved the solitude, the independence. For the first few months, everything was perfect. But then, things started to change. It began with little things, odd details that I brushed off. I'd notice a chair moved out of place or the front door slightly ajar when I was sure I had locked it. I told myself I was just being careless. Working long hours at the hospital had me coming home late, exhausted, hardly paying attention to the details. But then it started getting stranger. One day I came back from work to find the kitchen window open. I never used that window. It was old, with a crank handle that barely worked. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I had somehow forgotten. But that uneasy feeling began to grow, settling in the pit of my stomach. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise. It was faint, like a soft scraping sound coming from the hallway. My heart raced, but I told myself it was probably just the house settling or the wind outside. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I noticed the pantry door was open and a few cans were missing. I laughed it off, convincing myself I'd eaten them and forgotten. But the nagging suspicion wouldn't leave. Then came the night I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving softly down the hallway. I froze in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I strained to listen, but the footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I didn't hear anything else, and eventually I convinced myself it must have been a dream, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But the next day, I saw it. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. I never went up there. It was an old, dusty space that gave me the creeps. I tried to brush it off, but something about it felt different, more urgent. That's when I decided to buy a small security camera. I felt a little ridiculous, like I was being paranoid, but I needed to know if it was all in my head. I set up the camera in the hallway, pointing toward the attic entrance, and for a few days I saw nothing unusual, just the quiet, empty hallway. But on the fourth night, as I reviewed the footage, I saw him. My blood went cold. A man, thin and disheveled, was creeping down from the attic hatch. He moved slowly, almost carefully, as if trying not to wake me. His hair was long and greasy, his clothes filthy and torn. I watched, horrified, as he walked through the hallway, right past my bedroom door, while I was inside, fast asleep. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping I was seeing things, but it was clear. He had been there, in my home, moving around while I slept. I felt a surge of panic and nausea. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial the number as I called the police. They arrived quickly and searched the attic. I waited downstairs, my heart pounding, until I heard them shout. They found him hiding in a dark corner, buried under a pile of old blankets and junk. His eyes were wild, darting around as they dragged him down the stairs. He had been living in my attic for who knows how long, maybe weeks, maybe months. The thought made my skin crawl. He had set up a small sleeping area with old blankets and had been coming down at night, moving through my house, taking food, and using my things. The police took him away, but the damage was done. I couldn't stay there anymore. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards sent me into a panic. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. The idea that he had been there, watching me, creeping through my house at night, haunted me. I moved out the next week. I couldn't even bear to pack most of my things. I left them behind, not wanting any reminders of that place. Even now, in my new apartment in Seattle, I check the closets and the attic door every night before I sleep. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up hearing footsteps that aren't really there. They say cemeteries are places of peace, but I've come to believe that peace can be deceiving. For years, I found comfort in visiting my wife's grave at the Evergreen Cemetery on the edge of Willow Creek, a small town in Vermont where we had built our life together. Every Sunday, like clockwork, I made my way down the same winding path to her grave, seeking solace in the stillness. But one autumn afternoon changed everything. It was early November, and the cold had already settled in. The sun was low in the sky, hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly. The wind cut through my jacket, chilling me to the bone as I parked my car at the entrance and walked the familiar gravel path to Emily's grave. The sound of my footsteps was the only noise in the cemetery's heavy silence. As I approached her headstone, I noticed a man standing a few rows away. He was positioned just far enough that I couldn't make out his face, but close enough that his presence felt intrusive. Something about him made me uneasy. He wasn't looking at any particular grave. Instead, he seemed to be staring in my direction, almost as if he was waiting for me. I tried to ignore him and focused on the task at hand, kneeling down to clear some fallen leaves off Emily's grave. I spoke to her like I always did, sharing the small, everyday details of my life, how our daughter was doing in her new job in Boston, and how much I missed her every day. But I could feel the man's gaze on me, sharp and unsettling, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I stood up, preparing to leave, and glanced back toward the man. He had moved closer, much closer, without making a sound. My heart began to race as he approached me with slow, deliberate steps. His clothes were worn, stained with dirt, and his eyes. There was something wild in them, something that set every nerve in my body on edge. "Got any money?" he asked, his voice gravelly, rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. It wasn't a friendly question. It was a demand. There was no mistaking the desperation in his voice or the menace in his posture. "I don't have any cash on me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I rarely carried cash, especially not on these quiet visits to the cemetery. He didn't seem to believe me. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "Everyone's got something. Give it to me." I shook my head, instinctively taking a step back. "I told you, I don't have anything for you." My voice was firmer now, but my heart was pounding. He moved closer, blocking my path to the car. The tension in the air was so thick, it was almost tangible. This wasn't just a desperate man looking for a handout. This was something far more dangerous. I glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, but the cemetery was deserted. It was just the two of us, standing between the silent rows of graves. "I'm leaving now," I said, trying to sound calm, though my voice shook slightly. I took a step to the side, but he moved with me, blocking my way again. The tombstones seemed to loom larger, the space between them shrinking, the shadows stretching longer. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear his next words. "I'm warning you," he growled, his voice low and threatening. He took another step closer, his breath ragged and uneven. I could see the madness in his eyes now, the kind that makes a person unpredictable, dangerous. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my legs moving before my mind could catch up. I heard him shout something, but I didn't stop to listen. I sprinted down the path, gravel crunching under my shoes, the wind biting at my face. The sky seemed to darken as I ran, the cemetery closing in around me. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling so much that I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I looked up, expecting to see the man right behind me, but he was gone, vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. I drove straight to the Willow Creek Police Department, my heart still racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I told them everything about the man in the cemetery, how he demanded money, how he blocked my way, and how I had barely escaped. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Maybe they thought he was just some homeless drifter, someone looking for a handout. 3 days later, I got a call from the police. They had found him, the man who had confronted me. but he wasn't alive. They discovered his body in the cemetery beneath a crumbling headstone. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. There was no clear cause of death, no sign of how he had ended up under that headstone. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. They asked me if I had seen anyone else that day, or if I knew anything more, but I hadn't. It was just me and him, alone among the graves. I still visit Emily's grave, but now only when the sun is high and the world feels safe. Yet every time I walk that path, I feel a pair of eyes on me, watching from the shadows between the tombstones. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of those wild eyes and hear that gravelly voice demanding something I can never give. I thought it would be fun, a harmless adventure to spice up a boring Friday night. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was a Friday night, and my friends and I were restless, craving something exciting to break up the monotony of our small-town life in Asheville, North Carolina. We'd heard the stories about the old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town for years. Some people swore it was haunted, that strange noises came from inside at night, and shadowy figures were sometimes seen in the broken windows. None of us believed it, of course, but we were bored, and looking for a thrill seemed better than another night of TV and takeout. The factory had been shut down decades ago, long before any of us were born. It was surrounded by tall, overgrown grass and a rusty chain-link fence that had long since been cut open in places. The building itself loomed like a dark giant against the fading twilight, its broken windows and crumbling walls giving it an air of decay and forgotten history. It looked like something out of a horror movie, which only made us more determined to go inside. We arrived just after dusk, the sun dipping below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep blue. The air was cool and heavy, the kind of stillness that makes everything feel more intense. The factory stood silent, an imposing silhouette against the darkening sky. We joked and laughed, trying to mask our nerves, but there was an unspoken tension between us as we approached the entrance. The inside was worse than I had imagined. The floors were littered with broken glass, bits of old machinery, and scraps of paper that rustled like whispers when we stepped on them. The walls were covered in faded graffiti, and the air smelled of mold and dampness. We had a couple of flashlights, but the beams seemed weak against the thick darkness that filled the building. As we wandered deeper inside, the jokes started to die down. There was something about the place, something that made it hard to breathe, like the air itself was pressing down on us. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We finally reached the center of the factory, a large, open room with a ceiling so high it disappeared into the darkness above. The air was colder here, and the silence was almost deafening. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I noticed my breath coming out in faint white puffs. That's when I saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving along the far wall. At first I thought it was just the beam of a flashlight catching something, but then it started to grow, shifting and taking shape. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but then it became clear. It was a figure, tall and human-like, moving toward us with a slow, deliberate pace. I felt my heart stop in my chest. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. The figure seemed to move with a purpose, like it knew we were there, like it was coming for us. I heard one of my friends whisper, "Do you see that?" And that's when panic took over. We ran. We didn't need to say a word. We just turned and sprinted back the way we'd come, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, and I didn't dare look back. All I knew was that I had to get out, and fast. We burst out of the front entrance, gasping for breath, not stopping until we reached the car. None of us said a word as we jumped in and sped away, the factory shrinking in the rearview mirror. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, our nerves frayed. I never went back to that factory, and neither did any of my friends. I still think about it sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows grow long. I wonder what might have happened if we hadn't run, if we had stayed just a moment longer. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never let curiosity lead me into the dark like that again. I never believed in ghosts, at least not until that night. I had been working the night shift at a tech firm in downtown Chicago for about 8 months. The hours were long, but the pay was good, and I enjoyed the quiet after everyone else had left. There was a strange peace in the solitude, just me, my computer, and the distant hum of the city. But then came that night, the one that made me question everything. It was a Thursday, and the office was more silent than usual. The few people who normally stayed late had already gone, leaving me alone in the dimly lit space. I was finishing up a project that was due the next day, typing away at my laptop under the fluorescent lights. The overhead lights flickered now and then, but I didn't think much of it. The building was old, and it happened all the time. As I typed, I felt it, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow shifting behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just the empty rows of cubicles and the faint reflection of streetlights through the office windows. I shook my head, dismissing it as nothing more than a trick of the light. But the feeling lingered, a sense of being watched. I went back to work, trying to focus, but every few minutes I'd catch that shadow again, just at the edge of my vision. This time, I didn't turn around right away. Instead, I glanced at my laptop screen, using it like a mirror. And there it was, a dark figure standing in the far corner of the office. My heart started to race. The figure was faint, like a silhouette in the dim light, but I could see it clearly enough, a head, shoulders, a tall, imposing shape. I blinked hard, thinking it must be some reflection or shadow from outside. When I looked up, the corner was empty. I looked back at the screen, and the figure was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Just the lights," I whispered, trying to sound convinced, but my heart was still pounding. I kept working, my eyes flicking back to the screen every few seconds. And then it happened again. The figure was back, closer this time, almost halfway across the room. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I didn't turn around. Instead, I kept my eyes on the screen, watching the figure, as it seemed to edge nearer. I stood up slowly, deciding I needed a break, some fresh air. As I did, the lights flickered again, dimming for just a moment before coming back on. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The figure was now only a few feet behind my chair. I could barely breathe. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet, empty office. I felt the air grow colder, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones. I sat back down, trying to tell myself it was all in my head. But then, the lights flickered again, longer this time, and then went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I squinted in the blackness, trying to see, but everything was shadows. When the lights finally flickered back on, I saw it. Not just a shadow, but a full figure standing directly in front of me, pale and ghostly, its eyes dark and hollow. I froze. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt heavy, suffocating. I could see its mouth moving, like it was trying to say something, but no sound came out. A wave of panic surged through me, and I pushed back from my desk, nearly knocking my chair over. And then, the lights went out again. In the pitch darkness, I heard it, a whisper, soft and low, but I couldn't make out the words. I grabbed my laptop and ran, not daring to look back. My footsteps echoed down the hall as I sprinted toward the exit, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst through the door and into the cold night air, my hands trembling, my heart still pounding. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, heard that whisper. The next morning I called my boss and quit. I haven't set foot in that office since. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel like I'm not alone. Like there's a shadow just waiting in the corner, watching, waiting to be seen again.